this is passing functions around like props. And really, that's kind of all there is to it. It sounds more complicated and mathy and heady than it actually is. Um, the broad idea is that if I have some kind of outer component and it has state in it, say is on, is false. And then it also has a method that changes that state. So something like toggle is on. Cool. Now, where this gets wild is if I have an inner component that maybe has a button on it that says toggle, we can give, it's a different color, we can give this method to that component. We can pass it down as a prop so that it can change the state. What I think is kind of fucked up about this, and React is the only one of these frameworks that makes you do this, is they call this data down, actions up. This has never made any sense to me. It's really like data down, actions down. So where data down, actions up comes from is, draw a little bit bigger, is the idea that if I have this outer component and it has inner components, if I need to get state from here to here, then that gets passed like so. And then if we needed to get, if we needed behaviors, if we needed something to change this, like that toggle button or whatever, it would bubble an event up. And then you could add an event listener for this, and then once you catch that, change the state, and then that data goes down. So it all just goes in a circle. That's the idea behind data down, actions up. And that's exactly what's happening in React, except I don't think that metaphor helps. Because we're passing state in. Actually, let me use the same colors. So that is giving that inner component the ability to change the state. And then we can also pass that state into components if we want to. So that's the big idea behind this like data down, actions up kind of thing. So before we go any further, I'm going to pause there. Hit me with some questions. What's unclear about this?
I think for me, what's unclear is like when you are passing something, like or if you have like a prop,
Mm-hmm.
and then like passing it through, and then also like at what points if you're passing it through like multiple
Mm-hmm.
components, when do you call it or need to like call up the function?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you could totally do that. You can call it the same thing. You can change the name every time you pass it. In the React community, there's an idea that I don't all the way agree with, but it is really popular. So when we're passing it through a bunch of components, it's called prop drilling. And some companies will have style guides saying like, well, you shouldn't drill something down 3 times, more than 3 times, more than 4 times, something like that, because it gets hard to trace where something came from. Um, I think that the logic behind that is sound, but I think there's some forest we're missing for the trees on that. So I don't put any arbitrary rules on that, but some React folks do. Um, I'm sorry, does that answer your question?
I think so. I guess I well the part about like it not needing to be the same word is
Yes.
makes it more clear because I didn't know if I needed. I know it's just like holding the place of like
Mm-hmm.
whatever the prop's gonna be, but I didn't know like if it needed to be the same or if it worked the same or what.
No, it's very literally just like parameters and arguments in functions. What you call it in your function definition absolutely does not need to be what you're calling it when you're passing it in to the function. And under the hood, that's all that's happening.
Okay, thank you.
More questions so far?
Can you explain more? Sorry, can you explain more about the data down and action up, like
Yep.
in the picture?
Absolutely. So, in the traditional meaning of data down, actions up, you pass the data down through components as props. The actions up part in most other frameworks is this inner component emits an event. This outer component listens to the event and then also emits an event. It just keeps passing that event up. And so up here, I can listen for that event and go, oh, cool. So some button way down here got clicked, and now I can change this data, and that data gets passed down, and so it just goes in a circle.
Got it.
That same
Thank
thing
you.
is happening in React, but what makes it confusing is instead of listening for events bubbling up, you actually just pass the functions down so that the inner function here actually calls that function. We don't bubble up events in React components like we do in the DOM, for example. But that's where the metaphor comes from.
I'm still a little bit confused when you said we do not bubble up. Like,
Sure. So in React, you'll have event handlers like onClick and things like that, but they don't go up any more than that. Like you can't listen to events from inner components like you would in DOM elements. So like if I have if these are just DOM elements and I click here, that goes up so that I also clicked on this. And if there was a component, or a DOM element around that, I also clicked on that. And so I can put event listeners on any of those. If you remember, that's how event delegation worked, where we're just putting the event listener on a higher level element. That's exactly the same way that it works in every other framework, where these inner components can emit events. React components don't emit events up. And so instead, what we do is we pass functions down.
Is it because it's like confined to its own component?
Yes. That's exactly what it is. Now, like a thing that I think will serve you well as just a rule that you can lock onto with this is wherever the state is, that's where you need to define the method that changes that state. So if our isOn state is here, the thing that changes that to true or false or whatever, that needs to be on the same component, always. Can't be anywhere else. But another component can still call that function, it just needs to be passed it as a prop.
yeah, I learned this from yesterday. Like, you cannot passing the component to if it's not a child. Like, I mean,
Yes.
like I try to passing through but it needs to be step by step. You cannot like,
Yes.
yeah.
Absolutely. And so what you can kind of extrapolate from that is that if, let's say I have a component hierarchy that looks like that, if I'm using some state here and I need to change the state here, that means that both of those need to go up to the parent. Because the function that changes state needs to be in the same place as the state. And Alice, like you said, you can't pass it up and you can't pass it sideways. You can only pass these things down. And so you need to find some common parent that they have where you can put that then. Ask me more questions.
I have a question about you says cannot pass this up,
Correct.
but when we talk about hook,
Mhm.
that is totally different thing, right?
Kind of. Hooks don't let you pass stuff up. There are no component frameworks where you can pass data up. So hooks give us a different syntax for things like set state. Hooks are a replacement for that, and lifecycle methods, and some of the things that we still use class components for. Hooks give us a way to do that same thing without classes. More questions?
So Kyle, just to clarify that question. So let's say there was some state in a that needed to be shared between components. Even if you're using hooks, you would still need to define that state in a higher parent component and
Correct.
trickle that down, even if they are functional components.
Correct. Yeah, only being able to pass things down, that's like a law of physics in components. It's the only direction you can do stuff.
And to add to that, you have to also bring props with it, correct?
Explain that.
So, like when you set your state in your initial top end of your hierarchy, then in order for you to get the state down to your lowest hierarchy, you have to pass props instead
Yes.
of state.
Well, so yes, let's be like careful about the vocabulary on that. So props is always just somebody else's state. So in this case, it's state here, it's props once it gets passed in. In this example, the state is here, gets passed in as props here, gets passed in as props here. So whether something is state or props is a matter of perspective.
Okay, so if state is just if props is just somebody else's state, when I get props to my final location, I have to also add functionality into props in order for it to understand which functionality I'm trying to address to props. I know that was poorly misworded.
So if I have state up here and I have a function that calls set state, it's in the same component, has to be. If some child component needs to use that state, the state up here becomes props in here. And then
Correct.
I could also take this method that calls set state or whatever, I can also pass that in. I don't have to, but if this thing needs to change state or if the child component needs to change state, it can. And in both cases, that's props. because it's owned by this component and it's being passed into this inner one. It gets passed in as props.
Very well. Thank you.
Cool. More questions?
I'm just kind of confused about the syntax of it, but we'll probably get there, huh?
Okay. More questions?
Yes.
Yes.
I just want to, can you explain between the class and the hook? This use the right word, because like when we use the function, usually when we set the state, and then we can change with passing the pop down. And can you show it's between like a version of passing the pop down and when we use the hook, what is different?
So that's a different conversation. We can talk about it next week. But
Okay.
All hooks do is replace your lifecycle methods and like your set state calls.
Okay.
It's just a different syntax for that. And then since you're not using those anymore, you don't have to use classes.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so let's do a little bit of React. So give me, what's the app that we're making? Give me a noun.
Football.
What was it?
Football.
Football. Love it. Okay, so what we're going to do is this football app is going to list teams. It's going to let you add teams, and it's going to let you update teams. And so we're going to try to use the same form component for adding and updating. So just like always, the very first thing I do is delete a bunch of stuff. I'm going to delete, keep that, delete this. Delete that. Going to delete all of this. Going to delete that and that. And delete that. And then I'm going to clean out this component. Give us a nice fresh start. Okay. Do we have a working React app? We have a working React app. So let's list out some football teams. So in this component, I'm going to make a list of some teams. And I should be able to see those in the app. Cool, there they are. Get rid of this styling. All right, neat. So now turn this functional component into a class component. Somebody talk me through it. Bing, bang, boom. We should be able to do this fast.
You're going to do the class
Okay, what else?
and then extend and components.
Component. What else?
And on line 3, you're going to put the comma and put the components in there.
Good. What else?
I believe you're going to take out the parenthesis on line 1, and also the class state full need the render.
Needs a render. Beautiful. Very well done. Okay, so now this is a class component, but I didn't actually change anything, so this should still be exactly what it is.
Yep.
So now I'm going to move those teams into state. Cool. And they're still there. All right, we're reacting away. So next thing that we want to, let's actually loop through them though. So I'm going to say teams are this dot state dot teams map. I need to map through the array of objects and turn it into an array of JSX elements. Then I can make this dot teams. Cool. Something it doesn't like. Oop, I did it again. I did the same thing yesterday. Anybody see what it is?
You need to put a return line on.
There you go. Alright, there they are. So, oh, and it's mad at me because they don't have a key prop.
Hey, Kyle, can you explain the difference between returning outside of render and returning inside of render?
Yes. So functions have return values, classes don't. So you would never return anything just inside of a class, but you would absolutely do that inside of a function. So for functional components, that's the return value of the function is what we're rendering. Inside of a class, it's whatever comes out of this render method. But
Okay, so
then I just do that, and we're good.
So in your class, you're writing functions and then you're returning what should be rendered. And then in your render, you're returning the function.
Correct.
Sweet.
All right, so everybody's showing up now. Nobody's mad anymore. Love it. So now we need a form that adds a team. So I'll make a form. And it's going to have a name of team name. Not called name. And it's going to have a submit button. And cool. All right, so we have a form to add a team. So I want to control this form. How do I do that? What are the steps? Think about it to yourself for a sec. The steps for controlling this form. Josh C., do you have any ideas how I can start controlling this form?
I'm spacing a little bit.
Okay, somebody help Josh out.
I know they're gonna get their values from the state.
Very good. So this is half of it, is we gotta bind the value of it to state. So maybe that's something like, make a form key over here, and then a name key that's bound to whatever, doesn't matter. And then I can make the value of this equal to this dot state dot form dot name. Cool. And if I go over to my thing, hey, cool. So we're halfway there, bound. If I make an empty string, now it's an empty string. Okay, so it's half of it's bound. How do I update it? Because right now, oops. If I can type as much as I want, nothing's going into the input.
Why?
Ooh, why? Why isn't that updating? We should know this. We're halfway through controlling the form. What's the other half? If I have the value for this input hard bound to whatever this is, me typing in that input isn't changing that. I'm not updating state at all, so there's no state for that input to bind to. It hasn't changed. So what do I do?
You need to like change the state so whatever actual value you're putting in updates that.
There you go. Cool. How do I do that?
Good question.
Make a function to listen to it for that change.
There we go. I like it. So it needs some function that we can call onChange. So we can call this update form value, like that. And I can put update form value over here. And just to prove that we're in business, I'll pass in that event and log it. So when I type in that input, I should see this console log fire. Hey, there we go. Okay, so that's connected. Now the last thing that we need for this is it needs to do what?
Update the state.
Actually update the state. And I saw this in a couple code challenges I was reviewing. Hopefully we're not doing this anymore. Certainly not doing that. That's not going to work. Can't use this dot state equals anything. It's called this dot set state. And we want to set form name equal to probably something like event.target.value. So this completes the circle of life, and it rules us all. And now I can type into a controlled form. That's all we're doing there. It's a circle. We bind the state in. We listen for the change updates state. The state's reflected in the form. That's controlling a form. Cool. Before we componentize that form, what questions? Yep.
Can you explain it like again how the control formats work?
So the value on this input is bound to state. So if I
Yes.
want the value of that input to ever change, I need to change state. So what I do is I listen for somebody trying to change the state of the form, and it calls this function. Whenever that function gets called, it sets the state.
Thank you.
What else?
If the form was its own component,
Mhm.
how would you pass the state then through the function?
So the good news,
Can I jump into that?
yeah,
Okay, so on your input of the form, you would have to pass it down to that component, and then you can take props, and then through props, you can pass the state.
yes, but check this out. If I have that form in its own component, then I probably don't need this to be owned by the app component anymore. I can just have the form control its own state. What we're going to need to do though is we still have this list of teams. That's probably still going to live in this app.js component. And so to add something to that, the function to actually add the team, that's still going to have to live here. And that's still going to need to get passed in to our form component. So we'll see that in a sec. But first, let's get it all working just right here. So just like we were doing the onChange, how do I make this form actually add the team?
Are you going to make the function for the on-chains?
Not on change, it's close. On what event?
One on the on submit.
Submit. So when this gets submitted, we want it to add team. Okay? So we make a function called add team. Prevent the default. And then there's a couple different ways we can do this. There's part of me that still really likes doing it the exact same way we did in Mod 3, where we do form data equals new form data event.target, and then using form data.get name, like all the exact same thing we did in Mod 3, and that works. You guys probably learned this from Damon this way, and this is probably a more React-y way to do it. But our new team is going to be this.state.form.name. Since we're already updating